Hey, Bill Peterson.
Good morning.
Oh, my goodness.
Is it
you
working?
Look great.
Good morning. Is this what it was like working in Congress? You can't get anybody to sit down? Can I ask, can I? Sorry about that, but for our audience, we have an audience here in the store, and we also have a live audience, so we're trying to make a nice presentation for our audience. I'm Nina McLemore, and I welcome everybody here. I'm particularly pleased. So I've spent my life in the garment industry. So I've traveled all over the world. But I didn't actually, and I did have civics in high school, and I did go to Student Congress in Mississippi. So I learned a little bit about how our government works, but I really found Dan's book very interesting in teaching us how Congress can work, how our cabinet secretaries can work, and he has some advice about what we need to do now. So Dan was born in Wichita, Kansas. His grandparents were from Eastern Europe, and he became an 18-year representative for his district in Wichita. He then became the Secretary of Agriculture, and as he says, a Jewish boy from Kansas, becoming a Secretary of Agriculture, and then the chairman of the Motion Pictures Association. After that, he has served on the board of the Aspen Institute, which I personally love, and the Bipartisan Policy Committee. And most importantly, he is the brother of my friend Sharon Glickman, who has a great sense of style, among other things. His book is Laughing at Myself, My Education in Congress, On the Farm, and at the Movies. So he's going to be interviewed today by Margaret Carlson, whom we all know and have seen, but may not know personally. She is a lawyer by training, worked for the Federal Trade Commission, and then became a journalist. And can you believe was the first woman writer for Time magazine in 1994. I was shocked.
And the last, Nina.
And what?
And I think probably the last. I don't know what that says.
That's amazing.
But there are a lot of women writers there, but the columnist
yes, I should have said columnist. She then moved to Bloomberg News and was a panelist for CNN on the Capitol game, which I'm sure we all remember. So today we're going to talk about civility. Next Saturday, we're going to talk about Nancy Reagan's impact and influence on the end of the Cold War, which I think probably none of us are aware of. And then we're going to move to the fight for civil rights, not starting, but taking off, I guess, in the Montgomery bus boycott of 1955. So those are our next two book signings. So I'm going to turn it over to Margaret, and who's going to interview her friend, Dan Glickman.
Thank you, Nina. This is going to be very hard-hitting. I have known Dan much of my adult life, but there was something I hadn't seen. And thank you, Nina, for this. And by the way, this is my first time in real clothes in a year and a half. And I went into my closet, and what did I find but my Nina McLemore jacket? So it's a little wintry. It's a little dark for spring, but I love it. And I thank you for having us here. So I forgot my notes, so this is going to be a really good interview. But here's Danny, one of the few times in this book before I met him. He had all his hair, and you can just see why they loved you in Wichita. That is an adorable young man. And the reason it's not going to be hard-hitting is partly because I've known Rhoda most of my adult life here. I've been to every Break the Fast party. I finally introduced my daughter to a nice Jewish boy so I could legitimately go to Break the Fast parties. And I even lived with Rhoda and Dan for a while. So this is full disclosure. And I lived there because I was renovating a house. And Danny was during his time at Harvard at the IOP. So I came to this book, Danny, thinking I really, really, really knew you. But as I went through the wonderful campaign, that campaign, after the school board, the first campaign for Congress, it is like a made-for-TV movie. The whole family's involved. It's just a thing of beauty. And then when you get to the race that Danny lost, you see...
You remember that? Oh, my God, I forgot about that.
Yeah. I wanted to start with the painful parts. It's like a bookend, Danny, because you're in, and it's just an idyllic time. Bob Dole is a best friend. It's just beautiful. And then at the end, you're running into Newt Gingrich. And I don't want to do correlation, causation, but once you left, Congress just went so downhill. So I do want to, for the moment, say that it's because you left. And now we end up, instead of Bob Dole, we have Mitch McConnell, and we have somebody who said that 100% of his energy is devoted to making sure that this socialist administration of Joe Biden does not succeed. And that's where we are. So how did that happen, Dan, other than you left?
Yeah, well, I planned it that way. So first of all, thank you, Margaret. Thanks, Nina, and so much. And my sister Sharon, who's with me, has known me longer than anybody here. And then my wife, Rhoda, who's known me second longest from anyone here. I will be married 55 years in August. So that's...
Maybe you could give us the secret. Yes.
Well, my sister asks me all the time, what's the secret of your success? I don't know. You know, my dad used to say on their parents' anniversaries, when they had an anniversary, he says, you know, it seems just like yesterday, and you know what a lousy day yesterday was. But I don't say that anymore. But I just tell you the joke, because these jokes run through my book. But you know, I do think there's been a change in our political culture. There's no question about it. We used to have adversaries, but they weren't enemies. We had opponents, but they weren't people out to kill us. And we fought our battles, and we moved on to the next battle. And I remember as a freshman congressman, Hubert Humphrey, I think most people will remember him here, came and addressed a session of the House. The first time a sitting senator addressed a session of the House of Representatives. And he was dying at the time, but he said, fight every battle like it's the most important battle in your life. But after it's over, go up to your opponent, shake his or her hand. She is not your enemy. You will need him on the next battle that you fight. And there are no permanent adversaries in this world. And I think part of that has to do with the political parties have become much more tribal. We're much more afraid to cross party lines. There's not the independent streak that people used to have. And there are a lot of other reasons, too. The nature of our media is different. Money in politics is different. But it is a much more toxic environment than it used to be. No question about it.
I sent Nina today's column, and it's about Joe Manchin.
Yeah.
You were the Joe Manchin of your time, because you were always bridging gaps, and you saw the other side. You know, I quoted him as saying, you got to have faith that there are 10 good people on the other side. Well, there weren't 10 good people on the other side, or there would be a January 6th commission. But you did that, and you attribute it largely, well, not largely, but partly to you have a good sense of humor, and you went out and met people. Like, when you were doing the school board, you were out it was as if you were running for Congress the whole time you were on the school board, because you got to meet everybody. That doesn't happen today. If you were running today, could you run any of your campaigns now that you ran then?
No, because I didn't spend my entire life raising money back then. When I ran for Congress the first time, I spent $100,000 total. My opponent, who was an incumbent congressman, a really decent guy, spent $100,000 total. And I spent most of my life, my time then with Rhoda and the family, walking door to door. We must have walked 40,000 doors. That's all I did. I weighed 138 pounds at the time, you know, and I had hair. It was a whole different world. And you know, today you can't run that kind of campaign. You'd be accused of malpractice if you weren't on the phone raising money all the time. And then of course, I was lucky. I served in the majority the whole time. The Democrats had big margins. And so I was able to be more independent, vote more independently, And the leadership was forgiving if I had to kind of break with the crowd, so to speak. It's just a whole different world right now than it used to be.
There are also two kinds of politicians now when they get into trouble. There are those who apologize profusely and often head towards the door. And then there are those who just ride it out. Like Bill Clinton wrote it out, more or less. There are a couple of people I could name now who are just riding it out. And lots of times riding it out works. But in your case, you did ride it through one campaign, which was a completely phony scandal. Like today, it's laughable that you could write a check and cover it later, and that would be a scandal. Now that we know that billionaires don't pay their taxes, and Donald Trump never paid his taxes and investigated people, I mean, it was a feather. It was blown up, and that's one of the first, negative. It was a purely negative campaign run against you. Before we get to guns and abortion, which I think is what, in that last campaign, unable to tell your story about what you've done for people because there was just the hot button issues had come to dominate. But give me that progression. First of all, Rubbergate. Did you name it Rubbergate?
No.
Was it called Rubbergate?
Some people did. I called it House overdrafts, and at the time the House of Representatives had a bank, they called it, and members of Congress often wrote checks, and if there wasn't enough money to cover, they would take it out of somebody else's account. So it was a cooperative is what it was. But it became quite a scandal, and it was one of the things Newt Gingrich then used to really take over the House. But it was debilitating to me because everybody at home, CNN is it was one of their first things, they would list everybody's overdrafts over and over. It'd be a roll ad. I'd see my name 50 times a day, Glickman, 105 overdrafts. And and people knew that my parents were not poor, and people knew that I didn't necessarily need to do that. I just wasn't as careful. So I'll tell you what turned it for me. It was very interesting. So Wichita had its own thing of the gridiron, like we do in Washington. So Rhoda and others got me they wrote a song for me to the tune of Hey Big Spender, spend a little time with me. And I came out with an Uncle Sam hat and dollar bills floating out of my body. And I sang this song, just lost track, didn't know I'd have to learn to add or subtract. And over and over again, and over a period of 3 nights, there must have been 3,000 people that saw this. And all of a sudden, people started coming up to me and said, you know what? I've bounced a few checks in my life, or I've had an overdraft in my life, or, it wasn't the end of the world. And I've used singing. I think I have this great singing voice, but nobody else does. And so, but
we could test it if you actually want to sing
it. We could, but my wife would never speak to me for the rest of my life. But anyway, so I've used singing as a way to kind of get out of jams, and I saw what that did. That one thing got me out of this jam because I had a really stellar reputation, and then the overdraft thing. It cost a lot of House members their seats, and I didn't quite lose that time. I won, but it was by a closer margin. And then the next election came the abortion issue and the gun issues, and they became much bigger.
Well, you couldn't even break through with the good things you had done.
No, and because I had passed, I'm from Wichita, so half the airplanes in the world were made in my hometown, Wichita, Kansas. We had Beech, we had Cessna, we had Learjet. Boeing built most of the parts of the 737. And so I had passed this bill, along with Senators Kassebaum and Dole, that just revolutionized the small airplane industry. It saved them. And it had to do with liability issues. Stuart Pape would probably understand that, or Paul Zevnik would understand what I did. But in any event, I basically protected them against liability suits under certain circumstances. And we passed that bill, and it was August of '94. The next day, Cessna announced reopening their single-engine assembly line and hiring 2,500 people. Now, nobody does that one thing. And so I thought, no way I could lose. It's just like it was incredible. The press was wonderful. And I lost. And there was a wave, and a lot of it had to do with the right to life issue. Wichita became the center for the anti-abortion movement in the country. They had a Summer of Mercy. Some of you may recall that there was a doctor in Wichita named Dr. Tiller who got killed, a shot in a church right in Wichita. This occurred slightly afterwards. But the gun issue became probably the most powerful issue of all in defeating me, particularly among my Democratic base, working class base. And then the abortion issue was also very, very big. And, who knows, maybe I kind of slacked off a bit, too, as a congressman. I mean, I got to accept that that was a possibility. So anyway, it ended that career, and then 5 weeks later, I was appointed Secretary of Agriculture, which I would have given up my House job anyway to take, and so it just worked out well.
So before we leave Wichita for the farms, how did you get Rhoda to move to Wichita, which to me is the turning point in your life? If she hadn't gone, we wouldn't be here. How did you do it?
Carefully, thoughtfully. No, I don't know. She was pretty eager. She didn't mind. I mean, she knew.
That's what
kind
she
of,
said.
No, I don't think she minded at all. And in fact, when I ran for Congress, I think she liked it and wasn't particularly eager to leave to come back to Washington. And so it wasn't a problem. I mean, that was pretty easy. And she made a lot of friends in Wichita. It's a great town, not a small town. It's about 300,000 people, 350,000 people. And Sharon and I and my brother Norman grew up there and had a good life. And so it was fine. It was not a problem. If I had to do it today, it might be a different story.
Yeah,
That's the
I'm
only
going to
thing.
ask her on my way out. But the whole family ran that first campaign. That was like a father knows best kind of white picket fence feel to that campaign, with everybody pitching in. And what did you spend? $100,000
total. 70,000 in the general, 30,000 in the primary. Today, to run a race like that, you'd have to spend I don't know about $100,000 a day, but you'd have to spend close to $5 million on a race like that. And so it is a monumental difference. And I could run a 30-second ad on TV for $100 back then. So that's not even possible today. So you see what happened is, part of the thing is that in politics, I was able to do a lot of personal hand-to-hand combat, so to speak, door-to-door activity. And one of the things you learn in politics is when you go to somebody's house and they open the door, they're either going to try to kill you or they're going to try to love you, one of the two. And your whole trick is to target the lovers, not the killers, if you can. And we did a good job at that. And I'll never forget one town. There was a town called Hillsboro, Kansas, and it was the home of a sect called Bible Light. It was a Christian sect, but believed that the Jewish people were the chosen people. And so I came to that town, and I don't know if you remember, but there was a sign across the street, "Welcome to Hillsboro, the chosen leader," or something like that. And I didn't know what to make out of it. But what I did find is that being a Jewish guy in Kansas, where there were hardly any Jewish people, it was really not an issue at all in my campaign. And it may have been a little bit of a subterranean issue, but it never really impacted me very much until maybe the last campaign.
In reading this book could be a guide to life. I have a theory that there are two kinds of people in the world. People like Danny, who see the pony and the manure all the time. You're just a cheerful guy. Laughter is the straightest line between two people. Is that your... And then there are people like me, and my family calls me Debbie Downer, because all I do is worry and fret and get your raincoat, wear your boots. So I want to be more like you, actually, because when you lost, and since I've been covering politics, I've seen grown men weep for a long time upon losing. It's like really, really hard to lose, more than losing a normal job. But it only took you a couple weeks, a month, to find the pony. And it was in soybeans. Like, who would have? Well, you did have a rural component in your races, but still, you just don't come across as Secretary of Agriculture. But it's a cabinet post. It's one of, you were somebody immediately.
It was the most important cabinet post. It still is, but because if you don't eat, you don't have life, you don't have a country. So the rest of the stuff Secretary of Defense doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, and it was exciting. There were all these issues I never knew, GMOs and black farmers. There was so much going on.
Well, one of the things, one is I did make a point. I was on the Agriculture Committee all those years, and when I was elected to Congress, my chief of staff was my former debate teacher in high school. And she was like, people know her, she was pretty tough. And she said, you're going to go on the Agriculture Committee. And I said, oh, I don't want to go on the Agriculture Committee. I mean, our family was in the scrap iron business. We owned a baseball team. What did I know about agriculture? She said, you're going to go on the Agriculture Committee. It's going to change your career. And she was 100% right. And so that helped me as I was transitioned to Secretary of Agriculture because I had been on that committee. But the other thing that made a big difference is that, Garth Brooks has this song, I got friends in low places. Well, I had friends in high places. And I learned never to burn bridges. That was one of the things, And so I'm not a terribly controversial guy. So I had a few friends in high places. And so Mike Espy, then Secretary of Agriculture, had to resign because he had ethics charges. He was largely exonerated. So Bill Clinton the Democrats had lost the House, and he had to pick somebody who would be Secretary of Agriculture. Mm-hmm. And who did he turn to? He turned to Senator Bob Dole, the Senate Majority Leader, who probably said to himself, gee, this is a way to get
him out of there.
Get Glickman out of Kansas forever, never bother me. But I had him. I was elected to Congress in '76 with a guy named Al Gore and a guy named Leon Panetta. And Gore was the vice president, and Leon Panetta was the White House chief of staff at the time. So I had Dole, Panetta, and Gore, and they said, you got to pick Glickman for this job. And it was, and I knew Clinton, but not all that well, and I didn't have any opposition. Can you imagine? I was confirmed 94-0, and I'm still trying to find those 6 people to figure out what happened to them. But in any event, it was a different world.
And a better world, I would say. So, what was you go from, we have to go fast now because you have a couple more stops along the way here. I was very interested in your going off to the IOP, the Institute of Politics at Harvard, because it allowed me to move into the spare bedroom in the Glickman household because Danny went up to Boston. And I actually had been a fellow there, and so I consider it, heaven on earth to be there. How did you go? You've been at the center, the red-hot center of the political universe, and Harvard is the red-hot center of some things, but it's not like being in Washington. How was that?
Well,
and what made you do that after?
After I had left basically government to speak of, and I was at a law firm practicing law, and I was, notwithstanding the great lawyers who are in this room, it was not kind of a natural fit for me to be a lawyer and a practicing lawyer. And so I had a friend here in town, some of you know her, Melissa Moss, and she says to me, and she and her husband Jonathan had a lot of background at Harvard and worked on that. And the Institute of Politics is this thing the Kennedy family set up to basically educate undergraduate people at Harvard about politics. And so it opened up, and I applied for the job and got it. And it was a great time.
Everybody who is a recovering politician wants the job.
They want the job.
But you, again, the pony. You found the pony.
Yeah, and I may seem kind of nice and sweet, but I can be very calculating too. But hopefully not in a way to hurt people. But I'm a planner, and so I planned that out, and I went up there, and it was a great job to have for a couple of years. And you get to see almost everybody in the world. And
they all walk through.
And by the way,
yes.
I couldn't get into Harvard. My application to Harvard as a senior in college was rejected before they even got it. That's my grades weren't all that good, my scores weren't all that good, and all that kind of stuff. So I was never a stellar student. So I finally got into Harvard. That was the thing that
it's funny. I felt that way too.
We have people here who got into Harvard the normal way.
Actually went there on their own, Paul.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes. I felt like having gone up there, I got to put a kind of an Ivy League gloss on my land-grant university degree. Oh yeah, I was at Harvard.
Where were you land grant? Where were
Oh,
you?
Penn State.
Oh, okay.
I went to
All
Penn
right.
State,
Okay.
yes. I was sort of a farmish girl myself. It's not Wichita, but, there I was in Pennsylvania. So I'm not a bit funny, and you attribute so much to your humor and you come up with it to your success in life. So what advice do you have for people who aren't funny?
They need to, first of all, I'm very lucky to have been born with two parents who were extraordinarily funny. My dad was Rodney Dangerfield of Wichita, and when he died, we found 8 to 10 legal pads filled with thousands of jokes that every joke he heard, he wrote down. And he used to tell me there are about 100 jokes in this world, and everything else is a variation on a theme. And he had all these jokes. He was a man of one-liners, and people used to call him from all over the country. You had a boyfriend that used to call him. Speaker Jim Wright, I introduced my dad to him, and they were born on the same day, December 22nd. He used to call my dad for jokes. So my dad was that kind of guy. My mother had this authentic, very natural sense of humor. The one story I tell is I took my mother to the congressional picnic when I was in Congress in the White House. Rhoda was somewhere back in Wichita, maybe, and so I introduced my mother to President George H.W. Bush. He was a great guy. And so I said, Mr. President, this is my mother, Gladys Glickman. He says, oh, we just love your son, Mrs. Glickman. We just wish he would convert. And, of course, he meant from Democrat to Republican. And so my mother said, Mr. President, we like being Jewish. And so after that, every time I saw President Bush, he said, tell your mother I hope she's not still mad at me, and then I've learned how to exploit that a little bit too. These stories, I've had a lot of funny stories happen to me, but I've learned how to try to relate them to my life and how other people can do those kinds of things. There are very few natural comedians. I'm not a natural comedian. But the big thing is to take those things happen to your life, particularly where you can make fun of yourself in a constructive way and not do it like Trump did, where he was belittling other people or bullying other people. You never want that kind of humor. My dad used to say that's the bad kind of humor, where you make fun of it, unless you're like a Don Rickles that's exquisitely professional at doing that. But I found that sense of humor was an important part of my life in terms of turning lemons into lemonade. And you could build bridges that way. And also, often you could get people to open up to your ideas, and they might listen to you better with that. And we have turned into a rather humorless society. I mean, we had people like Bob Dole, who's really funny, and there was another senator from Kansas, Pat Roberts, who was really funny. Alan Simpson was funny. Barney Frank was funny. But when you think about it today, you don't think of many great political leaders in that category. You look historically at Lincoln or FDR or Reagan or Kennedy. These were all people who knew how to use humor to impact public policy.
Can you think of one now?
I'm sure that there are people in the Congress who have good senses of humor, but I can't think of anybody who's known for that anymore than there used to be. And, the atmosphere is toxic enough anyway. But, when you get members of Congress together, they're friendly and they're decent. And I have said before that most members of Congress today, I think, are just as good as the members that I served with. But the atmosphere is much more toxic. And one other thing is, I would say about humor, it takes a fairly secure person to be funny, especially in this modern world, because if you say something funny that is the least bit off the political correct line, it will be on YouTube for 250 years, and you'll never be able to get rid of it. And so I think it's made people extremely cautious in terms of their public life. For example, one example was Bill Clinton during there was a White House Correspondents' Dinner, and they did this thing about him in the Lincoln bedroom, and where is Bill? And they were, because the story was he had sold access to the Lincoln bedroom, and they made fun of themselves, and that is missing in public life.
Well, those stand-up routines at the White House Correspondents' Dinner are exquisitely gone over, and because you can get in trouble, and it's 10 to 15 minutes of a president trying to make fun of himself, but without going too far, as Obama may have in the one in which he took Donald Trump to task.
Yeah.
I mean, you can go wrong, and it is with you forever. But in an almost final chapter, but we're not anywhere near a final chapter, let me say.
Thank God.
Yeah, you got to the Motion Picture Association, where the showman of you, and Rhoda, by the way, really came to the fore for all of us who were blessed to come to the dinners where the first run of the premiere of a movie would be preceded by a dinner and an innovation by Rhoda and Dan of a trivia contest, which I won several times, I might add. So how did that job come together?
Well, I had, I'm just thinking back in terms of actually what was going on. I had been at the Institute of Politics. Rhoda has always been involved in entertainment. She ran the Congressional Arts Caucus in Capitol Hill. And we have a son that's in the business. Our son was president of MGM for 10 years, the film studio. And so, I mean, he's a real McCoy professional in this business. But any event, I had heard that this job was opening because Jack Valenti, who had held the job for 35 years, was leaving. And so a headhunter called me up and says, "Are you interested in this job?" And I had paid 10 times what I was making at the IOP. So that had a little bit to do with it. And and then I went and saw Jack, and he said, Jack is in his own inimitable ways said, "Hey, Dan, you're my man." And, kind of, he liked me. He knew me from my congressional days, and he'd worked with Rhoda at the Arts Caucus. And so I went out and interviewed the 6 studio executives, and I got the job. I mean, really, it was a job without a huge amount of politicking. And no, it was a lot of work.
A lot of work.
Yeah, but it was, it wasn't, at that point, it wasn't the most competitive job in the world. It was amazing because this was this amazing job.
But I think you understand yourself. It was a hugely competitive job. Everybody wanted that job.
They wanted the job, but Jack made the decision. And he wanted somebody that he could trust because he wasn't going anywhere in the sense that he was still going to be involved in the industry. And he wanted somebody that he could trust. And he, frankly, I don't think wanted a hot shot running the show, so to speak. And I think he had confidence that I would show him the respect that he would want and still, run the place. And so that's kind of how it happened. And, I went out I remember when he announced me, it was like the Wizard of Oz. I was standing behind a curtain at the Hay Adams Hotel, and he says, "And now here's my successor." And I walk out, and all the press in that room were like movie press and the New York Times and the Rap, I forgot, Variety, Hollywood Reporter, and I could hear people were saying, "Who's that? Who is that person?" And because I mean there were a few people that knew me, but not a lot, and so I had to prove myself certainly. But anyway, that's how that job came about.
I enjoyed your having that job a lot, and I hope you enjoyed it. So I'm going to turn this over to Nina in a moment for some Q&A. But to summarize, you chose the right parents, you chose the right wife, you had the right children. Jonathan and Amy are magnificent, and you had this great life. And I think inside this book, by the way, I read it in like one evening. It's really, it just gallops right along. That in here is another book.
That's the pony in the manure right there.
Yes.
All right, okay.
Yeah, there should be a pony on the cover right next to you. There's a book inside here of how to live a life. I've been lucky to know a lot of successful people. I mean, covering all presidents since George H.W. Bush, so you have to call them highly successful. But I don't know that many people as successful as you are and as happy as you are. So the book you need to write is to extract from here, because it's all in here, how to be happy and successful and not Debbie Downer.
Yeah, well, let's put it like this. I would not say that I'm at the epic of happiness every second of my life, because you can't be. But I was lucky to have the right parents, marry the right wife, to be born in a town like Wichita where I could achieve. My parents owned the AAA baseball team in Wichita, so my dad was one of the most popular people in town. I mean, that was big time stuff. We were affiliated with the Chicago Cubs. Our team was so bad that if somebody bunted a ball successfully, they called them up to Chicago. This is before the Cubs won the World Series. I mean, but anyway, and I learned how to get along with people, which is really and not to burn bridges. And I tend not to take things too seriously, even politics, with all the viciousness in politics, the toxic nature. And we really are in trouble in terms of our democracy to keep it going today. It's problematic. But I'm, the eternal optimist. My dad used to say people would much rather do business with an optimist than a pessimist, no matter what the story. In the midst of the Depression, when they didn't have any money, people would ask him how business was, and he said, great. Because he said people do not want to do business with unsuccessful people, period. And that was kind of a motto, of our lives and growing up, even with some periods of disharmony, which I talk about in the book.
In the beginning of the book, yes, how your parents, they got along better, so much better after you left home.
Yeah, I know. I don't know why. We didn't. Tony knows my folks very well, but growing up, it was a study in conflict, and I was the middle child, so I became the conflict resolver, the conflict avoider, and I had my sister on one side and my brother on the other side, and they didn't love conflict, but I think that I learned how to avoid it very well, and that probably was the reason why I got into politics.
I was a middle child and did not come out that way, so I don't know. I think it's just your nature.
Yeah.
You were born with a good nature. So, Nina, will you come up and really interview this guy? And I want to hear about your hard-hitting questions. I've enjoyed it, Danny. It's so nice to see you.
Thank you, Margaret.
This is my first time seeing you in a year and a half, and I hope to see you again.
And Margaret, of course, is with the Daily Beast, and she writes a lot of stuff, so everybody should.
I just wrote a review of Chris Matthews' book, My Life in Politics. So I've had the pleasure over the last couple of weeks of reading 2 books by 2 of the best people I've ever known.
And he's also a guy with a great sense of humor, too.
Great sense of humor.
Yeah.
Yes.
He's a little more politically incorrect than I am, but that's okay,
He doesn't have your discipline. He just works things out.
Right, but it's okay.
Yeah.
It takes all types.
Yeah, I'm a blurter. Anyway, Danny.
All right. Bye, Margaret.
Bye.
See you. Okay.
Thank you.
Let's hear it for Margaret. Okay.
This is a new career for me. But, one of the things I've noticed in women in business, because I've been in a lot of women business organizations, is some of the most successful women I know in corporations have a great sense of humor. It diffuses the tension in the room. But I want to go to your wife, Rhoda, because in reading the book, there are a few critical moments in which you refer to the advice she gave you or what she did. Our business is all about, we want to see Congress 50-50. Not 50 Republicans, not 50 Democrats, but 50 women %. So that's my goal. So talk about what effect Rhoda had on your career at critical times.
Well, Rhoda was the creative force, has been, in terms of almost everything I've done. And also she was the force that created a lot of the friendships that we have. And out of those friendships became a lot of the success that I was able to deal with. She was the one who wrote that song, and she's also never the kind to be obsequious to me. If some spouses don't tell you what they really think. She's not in that category, so it's made a difference.
The question everybody wants to know is, what can we do today to make Congress work again? And in the final chapter, you talk about three things that need to be fixed: money, gerrymandering, and civility. So can you, I mean, this is a long conversation, but.
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess maybe it's the Pollyannishness in me, but I'm still, I don't think the country's going to hell in a handbasket. This thing with the insurrection really did worry me. And without being overly partisan, Donald Trump was a nefarious force in American political life, but he represented a fair number of people in this country that felt the same way, that felt that government had overlooked them, that government was not trustworthy. And so I understand it from whence it came, but we've got to rebuild ourselves from this period. And it looks to me like President Biden has the right temperament to do that kind of thing. So it does take leadership that's got empathy and some sense of self-deprecating humor to help us out of this. Not just at the political level either. It's at the business level. It's at the nonprofit level. It's, we look at our president and members of Congress like they're the be-all and end-all, but there's a lot more to this country than that. And we're finding that outside forces can have a lot of influence in making our system and our society work better. I do believe that money is metastasized like a cancer in American politics, and I don't know what we can do with that given the Supreme Court decision in Citizens United, but when members of Congress do nothing but raise money, and that money goes usually for negative impact, that's unhealthy, and it also breeds distrust by the American people. And in the case of civility, I would just recommend that we go back and look at our schools to figure out how better can we teach our kids about civility, about how to resolve conflict, and how our government works. And so civic education is another part of these things. But there's so many complicated answers to this particular problem. It just goes on and on and on. But good leadership is a big part of this.
I think one of the most valuable parts to me in the book, and one person asked when you got interested in politics, and I've always said to people, I'm from Mississippi, we don't like the government. I'm from New York City, we don't like Washington. So your interest in politics is when did it start? And more importantly, what is it that you did to represent your people in Congress? Because we see a lot about the public issues, but not about the behind the scenes work. And I thought that was very valuable.
So I had a great staff, and I had a staff that would tell me that I was full of it when I was. And that is something that is just kind of missing. That staff is obsequious to their members. You see that with presidents. And so I think that made a big difference in a highly qualified staff who were out looking for me and out. So that would certainly be one of the things. But my career in politics started in the 6th grade. I was president of the 6th grade class at Fabrique Elementary School in Wichita. And it was probably just always naturally in the cards that I was going to gravitate into the world of politics.
And I was fascinated, but because you didn't have an agriculture background, you didn't come from a farm, but you understood that was a big part of the economy in Wichita. And then I had no idea, I don't know whether anybody else had an idea, that half of the aviation in this country was built in Kansas. So how did that influence, and how did you work to protect and make the best decisions for your economy?
Well, in the area of agriculture, even though I didn't have a background in it, my dad was in the scrap iron business and the oil business, and he had to deal with farmers all the time. And so, I learned from him in terms of how to talk to people. And farmers were like anybody else, I mean, it's like you talk to them the same way, you show them respect. You always show the people you're dealing with respect. And airplanes, I'll never forget, the school I was under was near an Air Force base, and the B-47s used to fly over and make all this noise, and the teachers used to complain. And to me, it was like a symphony flying over to see those B-47s and B-52s. And then we'd go out to the Wichita airport, And in those days, you know, there was no security at all. And TWA had their transcontinental flights that would go New York, Chicago, St. Louis, Kansas City, Wichita, Amarillo, Albuquerque, Los Angeles. That was the route. So we would have 10 to 15 TWA constellations a day fly through Wichita. I mean, it was like almost like a hub. And my dad and mother would take us out to the airport. First, we'd go to the A&W root beer stand and have a root beer. And you know, you remember those things. And then we'd go to the airport and we just watched the airplanes. And so I got interested in aviation because of that as much as anything.
So for those of us who haven't been in government and in the cycle of today, where do we go to find the information, and how do we make the right decisions in terms of who we vote for?
Well, you know, it's tougher today because you tend to watch and listen to the things that agree with you. So, you know, I'm not saying that everybody should watch Fox News because I disagree with them just about everything, but it's good to have a diversity of ideas wherever you're coming from. And that's missing from today. So 40 years ago, you didn't have that. You had very few unconcentrated. I mean, it was more concentrated media industry where you'd have Time magazine and you'd have the 3 television networks and then trade stuff that you would read. Fishing Today. There's an agriculture magazine. Believe it or not, it's called Pigtails. Tales. I used to read Pigtails. Can you imagine, Paul? I mean, it's like, and I'd get a kick out of it. You know, Clinton used to say, "What a country! Where else in America could you have a Jewish Secretary of Agriculture promoting the pork industry?" You know, and so you know, it was like to me. I mean, I didn't eat it, but doesn't mean I couldn't sell it. You know, and that was just part of the job. I tell you one funny story. So again, this is my dad. The President Clinton called me to play golf. I was in Wichita, and my dad said, "You got to go." I got this event and that event. He said, "You can't give up playing golf with the president." So I went out, and my daughter picked me up at the airport in Washington and took me to Andrews Air Force Base. And the president is there, and he's playing golf with Vernon Jordan, who's his buddy, and his niece, who's a golf. She's a good golfer. She's on the University of Tulsa golf team. And there's the 4 of us playing golf. And my dad says, "Whatever you do, do not beat him. You work for him." And so first hole, I get a par. And I'm not a great golfer, but a good enough golfer. And he takes it very seriously. And he's been known to hit more than 1 golf ball per shot on a hole. Okay, I won't go into any more detail. But he actually hits the ball very well. And so second hole, it's a par 4. Any golfers in this room? There's got to be a few golfers. Okay, it's over a hill and a second shot, and all of a sudden I hear a roar, like a loud noise. And we had the Secret Service on the sides, and I thought something had happened. My shot goes in the hole. I get an eagle on a par 2. So the president says, "Well, let's make sure it's your ball." Okay. And then the third hole, I'm thinking, I got a par and an eagle. And I said that, I'm in trouble. So it's a par 3, and I almost closed my eyes, and I hit the ball, and terrible shot, but it goes on the green on the par 3. And then I get right up to the hole. I don't even look at it. I just putt it, and it goes in the hole. So I have par, eagle, birdie. And all I'm thinking about is, this is the last job I'm ever going to have in my life. And he, you know, he was smiling, but I don't think he was 100% happy with me. And then I proceeded to get my double bogey, triple bogey, double bogey, triple bogey afterwards. It worked out fine. But and then he beat me, and he was, I think, happy. And he wrote me a note. He says, "Anytime you can play golf and get an eagle and say to hell with the president, you've done a good job for today."
There's nothing to repeat.
Sorry. I don't remember who said this, but there was someone who was on that subterranean train, going in to make a vote on something. And he said he was really thinking about his constituency and how his constituency would come down on this subject. And then he said after gerrymandering, he no longer had to think, that he knew, because his constituency was so gerrymandered, that it was all on one side. So you talk a lot about gerrymandering and the fact that we need to fix that. How can we fix that?
Well, there's actually some positive things happening at the state level. Some states have independent redistricting commissions now, so that you don't draw these lines just to fit one political party. One of the problems in politics today is that members of Congress don't have to appeal to a broad assortment of people. They have to appeal to who's in that small congressional district. And so the more that we can make these districts 50-50, so to speak, the better we are. That way, then, you have to listen to both sides before you make a political decision. And I think there is more and more interest in solving the gerrymandering problem.
I don't know that there's a solution to the politics have become more about the cultural issues than about the economic issues. And I was looking up some information about Mississippi the other day, and it is the poorest state in the union, and it does have at least education, et cetera. I mean, we are last in almost everything. But I don't know whether you have an opinion about how do we fix the education in this country and improve the economy?
Well, I mean, the truth of the matter is we're going through a period of great change in the world, and with technology and everything else, and the states that have kind of been the ones that have been behind are the ones that don't spend as much money per pupil as the states that do. We have a whole different cultural system because of the economics. Two parents often both have to work. I'm not saying that's bad, but I'm just saying that kids don't get the attention that they often would need from the schools in that process. And it could be the man that stays home just as much as the woman that stays home. But education is the key, certainly at a young age, to leaven out a lot of these problems in American society. And but it's a state issue largely. What I found is that while the federal government can put some money into education and set some trends, ultimately the states are the ones that decide what kind of educational system they're going to have.
One person has asked a question about the growth of the Hispanic population in the U.S. Now, as someone pointed out to me recently, it's not a unified population in terms of its political point of view. And the people who have a background from Cuba are different from the people who have a background in Colombia or Guatemala. But I think there's a larger population, Hispanic population in Wichita now. So if you were running today, how would you run?
Well, I mean, first of all, the country is becoming more and more diverse, and I think I saw by the year 2030, we're going to be majority-minority country. And the biggest part of that is the Hispanic population. It's not a one particular view on a lot of different issues, but you are beginning to see many, many more Hispanic politicians being elected all over the country. There are some Republicans, mostly Democrats, but not all. It's a great thing for America, as far as I'm concerned, because the more the country becomes diverse, the more likely we're able to solve a lot of our problems that we've had. It's a different world than when I was growing up. When, some of you may have seen all the stuff in Greenwood and outside of Tulsa, and Wichita is very close to Tulsa, and Wichita was not Tulsa, because Tulsa was really more south, and Wichita was more Midwest. But we had some of the southern roots there, and you come from Mississippi, so you know what life was like there. But the more people of diversity we have in our country, I think, the more we're going to be able to deal with a lot of the racial problems that we have. And I see it as a positive thing. And again, you have to have borders. You can't let everybody in, for sure. But I'm an example of what immigration did. I mean, I just think my grandfather came here with zero. Couldn't speak the English language at all, and probably half the people in this world had that situation happen. And that was the great thing about America. And now people are coming in who don't necessarily look like me, but have different colored skin, but have the same goals and desires and everything else. It's great. Immigration re-engages, reinforces, re-energizes the country.
So can I tell a joke?
Sure.
So I'm living in New York. I'm in an apartment building in New York, and my mother, who loved to travel, was coming, and we were going to have a party. So my next door neighbor, Mrs. Marcel, owned the liquor store down the street on Madison Avenue. So I said, Mother, we have to go shop at Mrs. Marcel. She's my neighbor. So we go into the store, and my mother, who has a very southern accent, is talking to her. And Mrs. Marcel says, my mother says to Mrs. Marcel, where are you from? And I don't remember where, but she was an immigrant, and she was Jewish. And so my mother, she said I was from Poland or wherever. So Mrs. Marcel could hear her accent. So she said to my mother, where are you from? And my mother said, oh, well, my family's been here since 16, blah, blah, blah. And Mrs. Marcel, who was about this tall, stood straight up and as strong as, and she said, well, I'm descended from Abraham. So we all need a bit. I think you're right about the humor. I think it really does deflate things. And you're right about a lot of other things.
It reminds me of the story. My mother was at Saks Fifth Avenue a long time ago, and she had a little bit of a southern, Midwestern accent, more than I do. And so she was talking and slowly talking, and the woman, the sales lady, says, "You and your southern accent, you have the map of Jerusalem all over your face." And I will never forget it. And she used to tell the story. You were there with her when she said that, And just what a world we live in.
Anyway, I highly recommend the book, and I think it's particularly good for people who don't know government and really want to know how it works. We didn't get into how he would go when he was Secretary of Agriculture and to the lunchroom, and to the cafeteria, and sit down with whoever was there and have lunch. I mean, it's just great. So I think it's a great book to read, and you can watch this on YouTube anytime, and you can forward it to any people you want to on YouTube.
Thank you, Nina. Okay, thank you. And the books are here if anybody wants one. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, whatever you want to. Oh, thank you.